the title of my presentation, which is Greece, Ukraine, and the wider Middle East, alternative paths, transitions from neoliberalism to catastrophic capitalism. And I start with an assertion. The neoliberal era has ended, roughly has extended between 1978 to 2008. Its main characteristics were the collapse of the ideology and practice of both actually existing socialism and social democracy, with the parallel decline of faith in collective identities, values, and struggles in favor of an extreme individualism. Second, the counterattack of wealthy classes, the Western elites in general, especially those financially oriented, resulting in the return of inequality in interwar levels. Third, resource to indebtedness for middle and poor classes in the Western world, to avoid the direct reduction in their living standards, gradually resulting in the loss of their independence and their conversion into postmodern serfs. Fourth, the slow emergence of China and selectively of other parts of the Third World as potential independent power poles, which partly resulted from a relocation desire outside organized labor movement areas, in part by Cold War competition, and finally by an internal procedure of catching up with the West for those parts of the Third World which have maintained or regained a degree of cohesion and independence. Fifth, the emergence of a new long wave of information and telecommunication technologies in parallel with its inability to increase productivity comparable to the post-war levels, besides short periods of time in some countries, for example, USA, from middle to late 90s. Sixth, the same was the case with the so-called Washington Consensus, which equally failed to restore productivity and GDP in post-war desired standards, aside again for some countries and time. The combination of the failure of the information and telecommunication long wave and the Washington Consensus led to the denial of the theory which argued that liberalization of international trade would not cause a long decline or stagnation in living standards for the Western poor and middle classes, as all the West would be lifted to a higher level of technological specialization, leaving relatively unskilled jobs for the rest. This failure, in turn, refuted the promise that the debts will remain at reasonable levels despite their steep proliferation, resulting in the fatal end of the era of over-indebtedness. The crisis of 2008 marks the end of the neoliberal era, an era of relative social peace within the West and between West and the rest internationally. It marks the simultaneous declaration of war from the part of Western elites, both against their own working classes and especially against the emerging global competitors. Briefly, 0.1% of the world population attempts to train a substantial proportion of the middle upper Western classes in an open confrontation with the remaining 90% and plus. If the class successfully finishes for them, then they will have the opportunity to untangle and their current allies, the upper middle Western class, in the same way that gradually the senatorial class in imperial Rome downgraded the position and prestige of the class of the decurions, the Ordo Decuriones. But this time is still apart enough. At the end of this fight, if things evolve as scheduled by Western elites, modern Western civilization, as cacophonous, though often heard this word, with its historical origins around 8th or 9th century and successive jumps during the early Renaissance, the main Renaissance, and culminating in the 18th century, the century of the Enlightenment, the French and the Industrial Revolution, it will be dead. A new imperial era will emerge with the largest concentration of historic power and wealth, barely comparable to similar historical moments of monopolization. Ancient Egypt, Imperial Rome, Imperial China are perhaps are rare in any case appearances of the same phenomenon. This threatening imperial era of the West, as already emphasized, if it happens, will be historically unprecedented because of its global nature. Slowly after 2080, we realize the key features of this new post-neoliberal era, a transition period indeed. The effect of the transition is still uncertain. As the Western elites seek to move into a new global imperial era, the main goal should be to prevent its arrival. We call this transitional period, following the collapse of neoliberalism and until the advent or prevention of global Western empire, catastrophic capitalism. Of course, the names we choose is not accidental. It has to do with the way it seeks to establish the new, where instead to inspire hope and a new vision of social evolution, it seeks through fear, terror, and disasters, the establishment of this new global order. We may be witnessing a historic change where catastrophic capitalism, unlike any previous historical reality, promotes disaccumulation worldwide, a selective, in any event, disaccumulation, of course, directed against the developmental effort of China, firstly, Russia and other BRICS and other, etc. countries. And the reason of this historical paradox, in few words, is that the accumulation process, as implemented to a larger extent, leads to a very rapid empowerment of the above potential opponents of Western elites, so efforts are made to inhibit or even reverse the whole process. Now, if we agree on these broad historical evolutionary lines, we can grasp the facts first of Greece and to a lesser extent of South and Eastern Europe, second of Ukraine and Georgia and former Yugoslavia, and thirdly, in the broader Middle East, but also in parts of West Africa, Asia, North and Central Africa, etc. In a new light, as a whole, quite heterogeneous the truth is, but whose evolution is shaped by the efforts of this 0.1% of the world population to determine our future, stopping the time and perpetuating its domination. From where this 0.1 is threatened. Firstly, mainly from China, competitive rise, but also to some extent from Russia, and etc. Second, from the efforts of the poorest Western classes, particularly those of the European periphery, to shake off the burden of indebtedness created by the neoliberal era and the rescue of the financial sector after 2008. Third, from the management of the consequences of climate change in particular and other man-made disasters of the late industrial civilization, against it, this 0.1%. Easily from the above, we infer the strategy of the Western elites, and this small part of them, the 0.1%. First is the gradual rise of non-Western power centers. They oppose the strategy of generalized geopolitical chaos through the dissolution of selected states in the wider areas previously described. I mean Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and etc., etc. Western elites lead today to the balkanization of the wider area, started from Central Europe through to Central Asia and Africa, using neo-fascist and fundamentalistic Islamic terrorist groups, threatening tomorrow with the same fate China and Russia if they do not surrender. Second, to the gradual rise of popular resistance in Southern and Eastern Europe in particular, they oppose the strategy of economic chaos, choosing the economic misery in first place. This is what happens now in Greece. They choose economic strangulation, the gradual removal of democratic and social rights that the post-war period brought, privatization and takeover of the national wealth and the productive base, leading them into what we can call economic balkanization. Third, to the rising warning signs of upcoming climate change, Western elites criminally choose to neglect them, selecting, therefore, the strategy of climatic house and sheltering in calm, private islands amid generalized environmental disasters, opt, in other words, the ecological balkanization of the planet. Simultaneously, they refuse to use the over-concentrated, overabundant surplus drawn during the new liberal period by directing efforts to alleviate the ecological disasters via, for example, the generalized use of renewable energy resources, which have the disadvantage to be almost equally provided to all and thus would be beneficial to a more balanced ecological and social development. It is common knowledge that any substantial improvement in the living standards of most of the world population requires increased use of renewable energy resources. On the contrary, Western elites intensify the flight to new non-ecological technologies, which fracking is an example, the search for hydrocarbons furthest in ocean depths and inaccessible until recently regions in the world, which is, however, expensive as capital and research intensive, so they can be monopolized by this small part of the world population. A long-standing civilization is driven through its gradual weakening and general decline, while attempting to draw behind it the whole planet through the combined strategies of economic, geopolitical, and ecological house or balkanization. The above hopefully sharpens our understanding of what is happening now in Greece, Ukraine, but also in wider parts of the Middle East, etc. Although apparently seems disparate and unconnected, we hope we managed to indicate their integration through the monopolization and imperial power of Western elites. Of course, this 0.1% is not without internal contradictions, especially since for its prevalence need the cooperation of wider Western, mainly upper middle strata, therefore about less than 10% of the world population. It is often obliged to adjust its strategy, not disclosing immediately and clearly its final plans of domination. In turn, this 10% of the global population seeks to preserve the benefits of the so-called golden age. The basic design is complicated, therefore, but this should not be confusing. While the effort to unify the geopolitical, economic, and ecological movements against the empire should be intensified, it should be done in parallel with efforts to compromise with the desires of the new global upper 10%, as it causes a weakening of its alliance with this 0.1% and therefore limits its chances of success. The careful selection of the common ground with the aforementioned 10% is an important and difficult task, but it is difficult and delicate, which in any event falls outside the limit of our presentation. Now, so I want to summarize and finish. As the neoliberal era is already behind us, a new transitional period which, with uncertain outcome, is now underway. The Western elites seek, through a strategy dominated by geopolitical, economic, and ecological house, or balkanization, to lead the way in the first historically global empire. If they can realize their intention, an unprecedented historical decline will be established with minimal chances of eradication. Fortunately, this transitional period is still in the making, so there is time for the vast majority of active-minded citizens who do not wish to see the dawn of this planetary destruction, to generalize and combine the struggles to avoid the geopolitical, economic, and ecological chaos, trying to prevent catastrophic capitalism to complete its work. Thank you.